All right, Rabosai. All right, Rabosai, good morning. Let us begin. Let's start first by thanking our sponsors for today's share. Thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Kislev, Sammy and Malka Esterson, for dedicating all of the shiurim and drushos this month in memory of their parents, Yitzchok Leib ben Aaron HaKohen, Sarah Rachel Bas Baruch Avram, and Hinda Bas Henech Ephraim. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the neshamas will have an aliyah and the family a nechama. We also thank our Daf Yomi sponsors in the schus of Refuah Shalema for Ruchama Aviva Bas Shein Nachana and for Rachel Yehudis Bas Tova Gittel. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Baruch Hu will send a refuah to Kol Cholei Yisrael. And above say with that, let us begin. We have a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. A lot of exciting halachas, Hilchos Pesach, even a sprinkle of Agadata. So let's begin. Yes, thank you for that. Excellent. So we'll say a lot to do today. Today's daf is daf Hey. We are picking up on Dalid Amid Beis at the two dots, right across from Tosis Midaoraisa. So we got into remember again yesterday, we solidified a couple of very important facts. Namely, again, that a Jewish home has a cheskas baduk, right? The Jewish home ultimately, again, is established as being checked already again on Erev Pesach. That halacha l'maaseh in a rental situation, whoever has the keys as of the 14th in the evening, ultimately again has the achrayus to go ahead and do the bedika. So continuing along in those themes, or in that theme, very interesting idea. Hamaskir bayis lechavero becheskas baduk. Also, listen to this case. I rent my home to Ruvain. Now again, based on what we said, if I'm an observant Jew, so I go ahead and I rent my house to Ruvain. And the assumption over here, Ruvain is getting the keys. Let's call it on the 14th in the morning. Therefore, again, Ruvain has every right to go ahead and assume that what? The home is baduk, right? The home is checked for chametz. So I rent a home to Ruvain, and of course, again, as we established, the chazaka is that it was checked for chametz. And what happens? So we'll say what happens. So Ruvain comes in the morning of the 14th, expecting to find a fully ready for Pesach home, and it turns out there's a dozen bagels on the counter. Right? So we'll say, so what's the halacha on such a situation? Now what are we asking about? What are we asking about over here? Matzo baduk mo. Mihavi kemekach tos olo. So we'll say one of the most interesting aspects in Choshen Mishpat is the concept of mekach tos, the idea of invalidating or voiding a sale or avoiding a transaction. That halacha l'maaseh, when something happens that is so against my expectations that it undermines the validity of the transaction. So if I'm renting a house for Pesach, it's a vacation rental, I'm going away, or in this case, Ruvain's going away. Ruvain walks in the morning of the 14th expecting a home that is ready for Pesach, and what does he find? He finds chametz there. So we'll say, so the shaila is that called a mekach tos? Does Ruvain have the ability to call me up and say, listen, transaction is voided, right? I got something about. So in other words, you didn't provide me with that which you promised to provide me with. You promised to provide me ultimately again with a rental that was bought, because that's the chazaka. The chazaka is, the presumption is that a Jewish home is ready for Pesach. So can Ruvain void the sale, or Ruvain void the transaction based on finding chametz? So Tashma, Dam Rabbi, so this is fascinating. Lo mi bai ba'asra de lo yoivi agra ubadku denechale leinish the kiyumi mitzvah begufei. So let's listen to this. Rabbi said, apparently historically, there were different types of practices. In some communities, it was the practice that you would clean your house yourself for Pesach. You would clean yourself. So Rabbi saying, in a locale where it's common for people to clean their own homes, so it goes without saying that when Ruvain finds the home unchecked for Pesach, he can't claim mekach tos. Why can't he claim mekach tos? Because Rabbi said, listen to what I could do. I could always turn around and say to Ruvain, mekach tos, just the opposite. You should thank me. Why should you thank me? I'm giving you the opportunity to fulfill the mitzvah of tashbisu. Right? I'm giving you the opportunity to go out and clean a house or to clean out the chametz. So we'll say, in a locale where people normally clean themselves, a person prefers to be able to go out and perform a mitzvah ultimately themselves. So in a locale where it's common that everyone cleans their own home, Halacha l'maisa, Reuven can't claim mekachtos, because at the end of the day, all kidding aside, he's being given an opportunity to perform the mitzvah himself. Granted, he wasn't expecting to do it, right? Really, again, I should have delivered a home that was baduk, but at the end of the day, he has an opportunity. Look at Rashi Abosai. Lo mi by heicha delo Yahave agra. Rashi says lachirim ubadki ela kol ish v'ish bodek es beiso. In a locale where everybody cleans their own home for Pesach. Delo matzeh meimer le mekachtosu. Demayisi odeh sheina baduk lo yisi sokra. Abosai, listen to this. What does mekachtos mean? Mekachtos means where I could claim, had I known this piece of information, right? Had I known the information that I have now, at the time of the transaction, I would have never entered into the transaction. So I'll say, in a locale where everyone cleans their own home for Pesach, halacha l'maisa, you can't claim mekachtos, because everybody's cleaning their own house anyway. So it's true, are you inconvenienced by this fact? Absolutely. But to claim that had you known that you would have had to clean the house for Pesach, you would not have engaged in the rental, that doesn't hold water in a place where everybody cleans their own home. Babai says something amazing. Ela filu ba'asher diavi agra badka. I will say, but listen to this. But even in a place where people don't normally go ahead and clean their own homes, but what? They have a guy, right? They hire someone to go ahead and clean their home. Even then, Reuven can't claim mekachtos. Why? Because we'll see, even though now, here's what's interesting. So this is taking place in a locale where people normally hire someone to clean their home. So we'll say, so now, not only did Reuven not get a home that was baduk, but what is Reuven going to have to do now? What does he have to do now? Hire someone. So he's going to have to shell out extra money. Even then, he can't claim mekachtos. Why? Because we assume that people like to spend money on mitzvahs. So we'll say, so quite an incredible idea. So therefore, again, as much as the chazaka is, oh, look at Rashi just a moment. Ela afilu ba'asra, tenehigi kol b'nei ir liskar boltkin kol ish bebe. So tika hashta chisaron kis. So we'll say, remember again, even if it's in a locale where people pay for someone to clean their home. So now when Reuven walks into my home, the rental, and it's not baduk, he's going to have to shell out money. He still can't claim mekachtos, because we assume that halacha l'maisa, people like to spend money on mitzvahs. And therefore Rashi goes on to say that if Reuven's claiming mekachtos, and I will say, what's really happening over here? If he claims mekachtos because now he has to hire someone to clean the house for Pesach, what's really happening over here? Really, he's unhappy with something else about the home, and he's trying to get out of it. But he's trying to ultimately, again, get out of it by hinging it on the presence of chametz. Therefore, I will say, what comes out of it is really something really, really amazing. So what you have over here is this notion that although there is a chazaka, right? What does the chazaka say? The chazaka says that halacha l'maisa, when you rent a home, you could assume that that home was checked for chametz. And I will say, what happens? So again, let's take a very simple case. I rent a house from Reuven. My vacation rental for Pesach. I walk into them on the morning of the 14th. I have the right to assume that what? The home was cleaned for Pesach. What happens if I can't get a hold of Reuven to ask him that question if it was clean? What could I assume? That it was clean. That's the chazaka. The chazaka says, whoever had the keys on the night of the 14th is chai for the bedika. Reuven's a frum guy. I assume he did the bedika. In this case now, I'm walking in and I see it's clear the home has not been cleaned for Pesach. So can I claim mekachtos based on that? And Abaye essentially answers, the answer is no. And Abaye say, interesting enough, the answer is no, whether it's a locale where people clean themselves or where people hire. So where they clean themselves, Abaye says, you can't claim mekachtos. Why? Because now, as much as I may be annoyed at Reuven, I have an opportunity to perform a mitzvah, and a person likes to perform a mitzvah. So, okay, I'm annoyed. I'm not going to say I'm not annoyed, but lamaisa, I have the opportunity for the performance of a mitzvah. But Abai goes further. Even in a locale where it's normal to hire help to clean your home for Pesach, you still can't claim mekachtos, because necha le'inish le'me'aved mitzvah b'mamoni. People like to perform mitzvahs with their money. Now, I will say, interestingly enough, normally that phrase is used in a different context. Is usually used in the following situation. What happens if I walk into shul? Let's say again, Reuven comes in, he's davening at the 9 o'clock minyan. I daven at the 7:15 minyan. I'm not here, but my tefillin are here. Reuven forgot his tefillin. Could he use my tefillin without asking me? Yes. The halacha is necha le'inish le'avid mitzvah b'mamone. Sure. Why wouldn't I want my property to be used for a mitzvah. Now again, you have to be careful how you use it. It was a 50-50. It was a 50. It's okay. Right? So we'll say so again, now you have to be careful how you use it. Obviously, again, it's going to be limited in scope. I can't go ahead and borrow your car without your permission because I need to get to shul, I need to get to shir. So svarim is a little bit different. The Mishnah Berurah brings down that svarim may be different because svarim by definition is an element of wear and tear. So it could be that people, Mishnah Berurah quotes an opinion that says people are a bit more makbid with the use of svarim, and they don't automatically just want people using their svarim. Although one could make the argument that today with our binding technology, nothing's going to happen if you go ahead and you use my Gemara. But again, fine. Shabbos, let's go weiter. Incredible cases. Tanan Hassam. Shabbos, now we're going to we might begin to get into like Hilchos Chametz. It's very, very exciting. So Gemara says, Tanan Hassam. Rabbi Meir, by the way, just so you understand, what's the hashkafa of that? So again, Abai is using it in that people like to spend money on mitzvahs. The classic usage of it is that I'm happy when someone else uses my property for a mitzvah, because at the end of the day, I recognize that what I own. We'll say, why do you have money in this world? Why do you have money? Why does Akash Baruch Hu give us money? He gives us money for a higher purpose. Obviously, He gives us money to enjoy it, to live a nice life. Those are all wonderful things. But those are byproducts of my money. What's the tachlis of my money? The tachlis of my money is dvarim shebikdusha. So therefore, again, I have the opportunity to pay for bedikas chametz. Or again, my property has the ability to enable someone else's spiritual growth. Isn't that the entire tachlis of financial or material ownership in this world? An incredible idea. Tanan Hassam, we'll say, here we go. Tanan Hassam, Rabbi Meir Omer, Ochlin kol chamish v'sarvin t'chila shesh. Rabbi Meir says as follows. The halacha is, hilchos chametz. You can eat, we'll say, now, again, I just want to point out, this is actually not the primary place for this sugya. This is going to be Daf Yud Aleph in Pesachim, where Mamish going to get into the halachas of chametz consumption erev Pesach. Here you're going to see it's kind of just being brought in derech agav. So listen to this. Tanan Hassam, Rabbi Meir Omer, Ochlin kol chametz v'sarvin b'tchila shesh. Rabbi Meir says you could eat chametz through the fifth hour, and you burn the chametz at the beginning of the 6th hour of the day. Rabbi Huda Omer, Ochlin kol arba, v'tolin kol chamesh, v'sarvin b'tchila shesh. Rabbi Huda says no. What we do is you could eat through the 4th hour. Tolin Rabbosai means we suspend chametz, which means you don't eat it, but you can get benefit from it in the 5th hour, and then ultimately again we burn it at the beginning of the 6th. So we'll say that's how we paskin, right? That's why halacha l'maaseh. Interestingly enough, we have this the time for final consumption of chametz is at the end of the 4th hour. But at 5th hour, chametz does not become aser ba'ano. Only 6th hour does chametz become aser. We burn it. The Gemara says, here we go. Dichuli alma miya chametz yisheisha solamayla aser. So we'll say, here's what everybody agrees with. Everyone agrees that halacha l'maisa, chametz becomes aser midday on erev Pesach. Right? That is what everyone agrees. Remember, the machlokes between Rabbi Huda and Rabbi Meir is about 4th hour and 5th hour. But everyone agrees, comes hour number 6, chametz is aser midoraisa. To which the Gemara says, Minalan. From where do we know this? Here we go. Amra Bai Trei Kroi Ksivi. There are 2 psukim. Ksiv. Shivas Yamim Shalom Azayatechem. So we'll say the pasuk says, for 7 days chametz, or sa'ar means, sourdough or yeast. So for 7 days, sa'ar should not be found in your home. Which I will say makes it sound like the Isser chametz is for the entire 7 days. Uksiv. Ach Bayom Arishon Tashbisu Sa'ar Mibatechem. So we'll say, but interestingly enough, the pasuk of Ach Bayom Rishon. We'll say if you were translating that pasuk, what does it refer to? What's the Yom Rishon? What's the Yom Rishon? First day of Pesach. That's what it sounds like. On the first day of Pesach, you shall get rid of the chametz from your home. So we'll say the first pasuk that says 7 days chametz shouldn't be in your home indicates to us that chametz is aser from the moment that Pesach begins. The second pasuk makes it sound like you can get rid of your chametz over the course of the first day of Pesach. So what's going on over here? Haketzad. L'Rabbos Arbas Labir, because Rabbos say, interesting enough, the Gemara says, Ach Bayom Arishon. Interesting enough, Yom Arishon is not a reference, is actually not a reference to the first day of Pesach. But in fact, Yom Arishon, the first day, is actually a reference to Erev Pesach. Erev Pesach. Again, we'll see where we get that from in just a moment. So the Gemara says, okay, so the Rabbos Arbas Labir comes to teach you that the 14th of Nisan ultimately again is for beer chametz. But I don't say maybe it comes to include the night of the 15th. And I was say maybe the halacha is you burn chametz the first night of Pesach. Maybe that's what you should do. Because also you might have thought, since it says yamim, you can only get rid of chametz by day, but not at night. And maybe I will say ultimately it comes to teach me that no, you can even get rid of chametz on the night of Pesach. The Gemara says no. Top of hey, the iskish. I will say this is an incredibly important hekish. The iskish hashbasas sar lachilas chametz, because Rabbi is saying the obligation to get rid of chametz. The obligation to go ahead and get rid of chametz is linked to the isser of chametz. Va'achilas chametz lachilas matzah. And ultimately, again, the prohibition to eat chametz is linked to the obligation to eat matzah, which I will say tells you that from the moment there's an obligation to eat matzah, there's an isser achilas chametz. And once there's an isser achilas chametz, ultimately, again, chametz must have been destroyed by that point. So since by the night of Pesach, there's a chiyuv of achilas matzah, there's an isser of achilas chametz, and therefore, again, there is an obligation that chametz must have already been destroyed. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, you cannot suggest that the mitzvah of bir chametz takes place on the night of Pesach. So the Gemara says as follows: Hashbasa sa'ar lachilas. I'm supposed to say, where do we see the comparison between the destruction of chametz and the consumption or the prohibition to consume chametz? Tichsev shivas yomim sa'ar lo yimatzei bevateichem, because the pasuk says for 7 days sa'ar chametz should not be found in your home. Ki kol ochel machmetzes v'nichrasa. Because also in the pasuk, because whoever eats chametz will be cut off, will suffer from kares. Shabbos says, therefore, you see that there's a link over here between chametz consumption and the obligation to go ahead and get rid of chametz. V'achilas chametz lachilas matzah. And also, what's the link between eating chametz and eating matzah? D'chsev kol machmetzes lo sochelu b'chol moshvosechem tochlu matzah. The pasuk says you shall not eat chametz, but rather you shall eat matzah. So you see there's the linkage between matzah consumption and prohibition to consume chametz. You see b'matzah, and the pasuk says b'matzah, by matzah, ba'erev tochlu matzah. So Rabbi say, so again, so here's what's happening. So Rabbi say, so interestingly enough, remember, this is our focus for this amid, which is everyone is agreeing that the Isra of chametz begins midday Erev Pesach. That's everybody agrees. 6th hour on the 14th of Nisan, Erev Pesach, the prohibition of chametz consumption begins. We are trying to figure out, and I will say, we're going to see, by the way, there's a difference in the prohibition of consuming chametz from midday Erev Yom Tiv until the start of Yom Tiv, and then from Yom Tiv and on, right? Consumption of chametz on Pesach is a chi of kares, but it's not going to be a chi of kares if you consume it on Erev Pesach. So we'll get into that. Like I said, it's going to be Daf Yud Aleph. But I will say, what we're trying to figure out is from where do we know that halacha l'maisa, the prohibition begins at midday on Erev Yom Tiv. So the Gemara says, we learn out from the pasuk of Ach Bayom Harishon, that the Yom Harishon in the pasuk, interestingly enough, is not referring to the first day of Pesach, but rather actually is referring to Erev Yom Tiv. Unless you think that perhaps it could be referring to the first night of Pesach. Maybe you do bir chametz the night of Pesach. To make a very long story short, essentially, once there is a chiyuv of achilas matzah, there is no longer any mitzvah bir chametz. Bir chametz must already be done. And since the obligation to eat matzah begins on the first night, therefore there's a prohibition of chametz. Once there's a prohibition of chametz, bir chametz must have already been done. Sa'ai says, lel yudad lebir. Maybe Rabbi said this pasuk is coming to teach me that as of the night of Erev Pesach, I already go ahead and should destroy the chametz. And I was supposed to say maybe Achbar Merusha is coming to teach me that already the night of the 14th, I should do bir chametz. B'yom ksiv. It says bayom, which tells that the obligation to destroy chametz is during the day on Erev Pesach. I ve'ema mitzafra. So we'll say, how do you know it's midday? Maybe Achbar Merusha teaches me that from the moment the sun comes up on Erev Pesach, then what? Chametz should be aser. To which the Gemara says, ach chilek. We have this concept throughout Shas, that the word ach it makes a division. So ach bayom harishon teaches me that for part of the first day not referring to the first day of Pesach, but rather first day referring to Erev Pesach, for part of the day of Erev Pesach, halacha l'maisa, chametz will be aser, which teaches us that from midday on, from the 6th hour and on Erev Pesach, chametz is aser mid'oraisa. Tibei Rabbi Yishmael Tana. So we'll say, so again, so now so far we are clear that chametz is going to be asar and erev Pesach from 6 hours and on, from the 6th hour and on, based on the pasuk of Ach bayom harishon tashbisu sa'ar mibatechem. Good. Tibei Rabbi Yishmael Tana matzini yedal shnei karishon. So we'll say, interestingly enough, we find the 14th of 14th of Nisan, that it's called Rishon. Shnei Amar Barishon Ba'arba Asar Yom Lachodesh. Because we'll say the Gemara over here quotes the pasuk, and the pasuk says Barishon Ba'arba Asar Yom Lachodesh Ba'erev Tochlu Matzos. So we'll see. So you see again that this is. We'll say we have to take a step back. How do you know, right? Pasha Pshat in the pasuk of Ach Bayom Harishon Tashbisu Sa'ar Mibatechem. Barishon, the Pasha Taich, the Pasha translation of the pasuk is what is Rishon referring to? First day of Pesach. The Gemara is interpreting it to mean that Rishon means no, Erev Pesach. To which Tana Debei Rabbi Yishmael comes along and says, I want to tell you why. We find the 14th of Nisan referred to as Rishon. Quoting the pasuk over here, Barishon Ba'arba Asayom L'Chodesh. Because it says on the first day, on the 14th day of the month. So you see that Erev Pesach is referred to as Rishon. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar, Rishon de Meikara Mashma. So we'll say, interestingly enough, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says that's also because Rishon, we'll say, sometimes can mean de Meikara. We'll say, if you look at Rashi, Rashi says, Rishon de Meikara Mashma, Belav Rumya de Krai Adodi, Mashma Rishon Mashmos Tikra, Shuyom Kodem Lechol Shivas Tikra. So we'll say, listen to this. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak is going to say like this. Rishon sometimes Rabbi say could actually refer to not the first day, but it could actually refer to the day before the first day. So the pasuk of Ach bayom harishon tashbisu sa'ar mibatechem could actually be translated as on the day before the first day of Pesach, you should rid your home from chametz. Rabbi say, where do you see that Rishon could mean the day before? So the Gemara says, the Amar Kra Harishon Adam Tivalit. So Rabbi say a pasuk in Eov, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Eov, were you born before Adam Harishon? So Rabbi say, so again, Harishon over here means were you born before? Right? Were you born before the first man? So you see Rishon, Rabbi say, can mean sometimes not the first day, but the day before the first day. Elameata. But 1 second, I will say that's a very dangerous thing. So you're going to tell me then that every time the Torah says Rishon, Rishon doesn't mean the first day of the Yom Tov, but Rishon means the day before the first day of Yom Tov. What about the pasuk by Lulav and Esrig? The pasuk says you shall take for yourself on the first day. Speaking about Lulav, Esrig, and Dasan, and Rava, so you're going to tell me, so what is it telling me? That the obligation for Daled Mina Bosa is when? Is going to be on Erev Yom Tiv? Is that what you're saying? To which the Gemara says, Shaini Hasam Dichsev, Usmachtim Lifnei Hashem Elokechem, Shivas Yomim. Bosa is different because by Sukkot it says you shall rejoice before HaKadosh Baruch Hu 7 days. Mashvi Ishvi Lachag, just like the 7th day is a reference to the actual 7th day of the Yom Tiv. Af Rishon, Rishon Lachag. So to again Rishon by Sukkis refers or by Daled Minim ultimately again refers to the first day. Halchanam Iksiv Ach Bayom Rishon Tashbisu Shivas Yomim Masos Tochelu. I believe you could say something by Pesach. Pesach also has a reference to the first day and the 7th day. So why don't you say, just like the 7th day refers to the 7th day, so to the first day refers to the first day. And maybe when the Torah says, Ach bayom harishon teshbisem mivatechem, literally is teaching me what? That when is the obligation to bear chametz? When? First day of Pesach. To which the Gemara says, Imkain, nichtov kra rishon. If that's the case, then by chametz, let the Torah say rishon. Harishon lamali. I will say the Torah purposely uses an elongated form of the word harishon, the first day, to teach you that the first day that is being referred to over here is not the first day of Yom Tiv, but rather it is the first day before the first day of Yom Tiv. What's the first day before the first day of Yom Tiv? Erev Yom Tiv, the 14th of Nisan. Shema Mino L'Chida Amron. Sefer will say again, so the Gemara is kind of sticking to his guns over here, understanding that Ach Bayom Harishon, the Yom Harishon over here is not a reference to the first day of Yom Tiv, but rather, again, as a reference to Erev Yom Tiv. Why? Because we have this precedent that sometimes Rishon doesn't mean the first day of, but rather it means the day before the first day of. Ihachi Hasam Nami Harishon Lamali. But I'll say if that's the case, then ultimately, again, remember, by Daled Minim, right? By lulav esrog adas, it also says harishon, right? It also uses that prolonged form. Visu hasam dichsiv biyom harishon shabbason ubayom hashmini shabbason. So we'll say again by Sukkot it's even more complicated because remember again what does it say by Sukkot? It says Ubayom Harishon on the first day of Yom Tiv and on the 8th day of Yom Tiv. So maybe it means Ein Marishon Demei Karamashma. So we'll say maybe it means again that you should celebrate on Erev Yom Tiv and the day before the 8th day. Shiny Hasan the Amrikra Ubayom Hashmini Shabbason. We'll say there it's different because by Sukkot it says the 8th day, which is reference to Shmini Atzeres. Mashmini Shmini Dechag. Just like the 8th day by Sukkot refers to the 8th day Shmini Atzeres. Afrishon Rishon Dechag. So too again, the first day as reference to Sukkot is a reference to the first day. So the Gemara says, Harishon Lamali. So we'll say if that's the case, then why does the Torah use the elongated form by Sukkot? See, Rabbi say, by Pesach, we just established, the Torah uses the phrase Harishon as opposed to Rishon. Why? Because the Harishon is one of the steps in helping us establish that the first day mentioned by Pesach, by destruction of Chametz, is not the first day of Pesach, but it's Erev Pesach. But by Sukkot, we're establishing that Rishon means the first day of Yom Tiv. So it means the first day of Yom Tiv. Why are you saying Harishon? Harishon Amali? Oh, Lemiute Cholol Shamoed. Because it was coming to exclude Chalamayid. That whereas on the first day and on the 8th day, there is an Isser Malacha. One is not permitted to do Malacha. Harishon teaches me that the Isser Malacha is dafka only on the first day and on the 8th day, but not on Chalamayid. Right? That the Sinai Basina, obviously Chalamayid does have limitations, but it doesn't have the Isser Malacha like you experience on Yom Tov itself. To which the Gemara says, Cholol Shamoed, Merishon Shmini Nafka. But we'll say ultimately, again, I could learn out the exclusion of Chalamayid without Harishon and Hashmini. That's just learned out from Rishon and Shmini. It's Saradait Chamina, Holo de Kaser Rachmana Ubayom Hashmini, because we'll say you might have thought as follows, since the Torah says Ubayom Hashmini, an elongated form, Vav Mosif al Inyan Rishon, Dafilu B'chol Shomai. So we'll say maybe because it's an elongated form, that Yom Hashmini is also coming to include that there's an Isser Malacha on Chalamayid. Kamash Malam, no, that there is no Isser Malacha on Chalamayid itself. So we'll say, let's just make this simple. So we'll say, so why don't we just get rid of both the vav and the hey by Sukkot and just make it easy? Hasam dichsiv, the Gemara says, Hasam dichsiv, bayom harishon mikra kodesh yalachem, rishon demei karat mashma. We'll say furthermore again, we have another bayom harishon. So why don't we say ultimately again that this bayom harishon, ultimately which is by Pesach, why don't we say again that bayom harishon also comes to mean Erev Yom Tiv? Ella, we'll say, here we go. Elahani shlosha rishon mi baile. I will say these three rishons. And I will say now, just so we're clear on the three rishons. If you see Rashi, bischar gimel rishon. We're skipping a little bit. We can look. Shvisas haregel de Pesach, ushvisas haregel de Chag, unetilas lulav shinik rishon. So we'll say. So there are three rishons over here. One rishon is to teach me about the Isser Malacha on Pesach. The second rishon is to teach you about the Isser Malacha on Sukkot. And the third Rishon, ultimately, again, is the Rishon in reference to Daled Minim, Lulav and Esrog. So the Gemara says these three Rishons serve a different purpose. What do they need? What do they need? For L'chiditani Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. Here I go, a beautiful Gemara. Ditani Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. Bischar Shlosha Rishon, in the Zechus of the three Rishons, Zachu L'Shlosha Rishon. Klal Yisrael merits three more Rishons. So we'll say in the Zechus, of observing the Isser Malacha on Pesach, on Sukkot, and taking Lulav and Esrog, Klal Yisrael gets rewarded in three different ways. What are the three different ways? Here we go, I'll say. So the Gemara says, Lahachris Zaro Shal Esav, the Binyan Beis Hamikdash, Ulishmo Shal Mashiach. I will say, in the Zechus of not doing Malacha on Pesach, which is Rishon, Sukkot, Rishon, and taking Daled Midim Rishon, we get three Rishons. What are the three Rishons? Ultimately, again, to go ahead and eliminate Esav, to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash, and the coming of Mashiach. So we'll say, we'll put this together in just a moment. Zaro Shal Esav, we'll say, Zaro Shal Esav. So where do you see that cutting off Esav, ultimately again is Rishon? Vayetzi HaRishon Admoni Kulo Kades Kaderes. Because we'll say the Pasuk, when it refers to Esav, says that Esav came out first, right? Fully filled with hair, right? Like Kaderes Seir. Over the Binyan Beis HaMikdash Tichsiv, Kise kavan marom miroshem, mirishon makom mikdashenu. You see, the Beis Hamikdash is referred to as Rishon. Ulishmo shal Mashiach, and ultimately, again, for literally the name of Mashiach, but it means the coming of Mashiach, to Siv, Rishon Litzion Hina Hanem. So we'll say, listen to this. The Gemara quotes that pasuk. Yeah, Rishon Litzion Hina Mulushaim Mevasar Eitan. So we'll say, what's the pshat? So what's the pshat in the zechus of observing Pesach, Sukkot, and taking Daled Minim? We are privileged to cut off Esav, to eliminate Esav, to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash, and ultimately, again, to go ahead and get Mashiach. So we'll say, there's a beautiful Marsha. I'm going to send it out in the WhatsApp afterwards. But I'll just read to you. The Marsha says as follows. He goes ahead and he explains, Rabbi say, that ultimately, again, just outside, he says, Ki hashvisa b'Pesach. Remember again, Bo nigalu min ha'mishabdim osam. What happened on Pesach, Rabbi say? Pesach, we were redeemed from those who enslaved us. Mitzrayim. So in the schus of Pesach, we will overcome our future enemies as well. So again, just like we overcame the Egyptians, in the zechus of Pesach, ultimately again, we will overcome Esav. What was the second Rishon? In the zechus of observing Sukkot, ultimately again, we get the Beis Hamikdash. This is the Marsha. The Beis Hamikdash is often referred to as a sukkah. Right? Ufro salenu sukkah shalom. So ultimately, again, in the zechus of going ahead and building our sukkah, which was on a deeper level, the Zohar writes that a sukkah is tzila dehemenusa. It's considered to be walking into the protective embrace of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In the zechus of having emunah, to leave the structure of our homes and entering into the temporary domicile of the sukkah, because realize we're entering into the embrace of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we'll be zochem to get the Beis Hamikdash, which is the most incredible physical manifestation of the divine embrace. And in the zechus of Daled Minim, ultimately again we go ahead and we get Mashiach. So he says over here, so with Tam mitzas lulav shnei rabah rishon, aydesh asimcha ulakachtem lachem usmachtem yisku lesimcha liasid lavo bevo Mashiach. Rabbi say, listen to how beautiful this is. The Daled Minim, Rabbi say, the taking of the Daled Minim are associated with the simcha of Sukkot. How does Mashiach come, Rabbi say? How does Mashiach come? Besimcha. If we learn to live besimcha, and we learn to find the joy in life, and we learn to find the joy in our avodas Hashem, then Rabbi say, ultimately Mashiach will come. How incredibly beautiful. In the zechus of properly observing Pesach and believing that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has redeemed us from our enemies and will redeem us from our enemies, we will overcome Edom. In the zechus of properly observing Sukkah, maximizing the Sukkah experience, losing ourselves in the protective embrace of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we will have the Beis Hamikdash. And in the zechus of finding simcha in mitzvahs, Rabbi say, because that's where simcha comes from. Everyone is looking for joy. Everyone is looking for happiness. Simcha. We will say, what's the great challenge of life? Often we look for happiness in all the wrong places. We think that at the end of the day, so many things are going to bring us happiness. They might bring us a little bit of pleasure, but they don't bring us happiness. The only thing that real simcha comes from in life is avodas Hashem. That is the only thing that gives you simcha. And that's why the mitzvah of Daled Minim ultimately again is associated with simcha. If we learn to find simcha in our Yiddishkeit, we learn to find simcha in our avodas Hashem, the reward for that is the ultimate simcha. The simcha of Mashiach. So we'll say the Gemara goes right. Incredible. Rava Aron. So we'll say back to the Gemara. Rava says from here. We'll say again, we're focused on the same thing here. We're focused on trying to figure out ultimately how I know that the Isser Chametz goes ahead and begins on Erev Pesach. So Rava has a different interpretation. Lo sishchat al chametz dam zivchi. So we'll say another limud. So remember, first limud was ach bayom. Remember this. Just remember these ideas. Ach bayom rishon tashbisu sami batechem. That's step one. Right? Possibility number two. Rava says lo sishchat al chametz dam zivchi. Literally translated, do not shecht while the chametz is present, the blood of my offerings. How do we interpret that pasuk? Lo sishchat haPesach v'adayin chametz kayim. We'll say very simple limud. The pasuk's teaching me, do not shecht the carbon Pesach while chametz is still present. Now we'll say, remember again, when can you shecht the carbon Pesach? As of, right, midday erev Yom Tiv. Midday erev Yom Tiv. So therefore again, Rav is saying, the halacha is telling me, as soon as you can shecht the carbon Pesach, you cannot have chametz around. That's the halacha. Can't have chametz around when you shech the Korban Pesach. The Gemara says, Ve'ema kol chad v'chad kishach zman shchita. So I'm sorry. Ve'ema kol chad v'chad kishach. So maybe what it means is, look, maybe it's a subjective time. So you just have to make sure that when you shech the Korban Pesach, you have no more chametz in your home. I have to make sure when I shech my Korban Pesach, there's no more chametz in my home. But maybe again, it's not a hard and fast time at midday on Erev Yom Tiv. To which the Gemara says, no. The Gemara says, Zman shchita am rachmana. The Torah says Zman Shchita. At the time when you could offer up the Korban Pesach, halacha l'maisa, you cannot go ahead and have chametz around. So we'll say this is another incredible limud. The Korban Pesach therefore can be offered as of midday and Erev Yom Tiv. So from the moment that Korban Pesach can be offered, chametz cannot be present. So from here we learn that the Isser D'Oraisa of chametz begins when? Midday Erev Yom Tov. We'll say this is a much simpler limud. The other limud, Ach B'Yom Rishon, required a lot of maneuvering, right? Rishon doesn't mean Rishon. Rishon means the day before Rishon. This seems to be much more straightforward. Time Nachar that supports this. Ach B'Yom Rishon Tashbis Mivatechem. So the Gemara says, the pasuk says, on the first day, you should remove stuff from your home. So the Gemara says, Me'erev Yom Tiv, this refers to Erev Yom Tiv, like we said before. Or maybe it means Yom Tiv itself. Talmud Lomar lo sishchat al chametz dam zivchi, lo sishchat es ha-pesach, va'adayin chametz, kayim divrei Rabbi Yishmael. So we'll say, listen to this. According to this, you see what the Brisa just did? It's very exciting, incredibly exciting. We'll say, what's going on over here today? Mamish, everybody got a little extra sleep? No, come on, this is incredible. No, yeah, a little something. We'll say, remember again, what's incredible about this brisa, is this brisa is bringing both concepts together. We'll say, right, so the brisa quotes first, Ach Bayom Arishon, and then says, maybe Ach Bayom Arishon means maybe first day of Pesach, or maybe it means the night of Pesach. No. Lo sishchat al chametz dam zivchi. You cannot have chametz around at the time that the Korban Pesach can be offered. Korban Pesach can be offered already as of midday Erev Yom Tiv, and therefore no chametz midday Erev Yom Tiv. That's Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Kiva Omer, Ein lo tzarich. Rabbi Kiva says you don't even need that whole limud. Hari Omer, Ach Bayom Arishon, Tashbisu Sa'ar Mibatechem. We'll say, get ready for this. This is incredible. We'll say, I want to point out what the good news is over here. Well, the good news is we're learning Torah together. That's the best news in the world. The other good news, we'll say, is no one's arguing on the conclusion. Right? I just want to be clear. Everyone is agreeing that you can't eat chametz after midday on Erev Pesach. So it's always nice when you have a machlokes like this. The conclusion is not in question. The shaila just is, what's the limud? What's the limud? How do you learn it out? So let's listen to this. Rabbi Kiva says you don't even need this whole limud. Watch this. It's incredible. The pasuk says, on the first day you shall rid your home of all chametz. Uksev kol melacha lo sasu. But the Torah also says that even on Yom Tiv you're not allowed to do malacha. Umatzinu la'avarashi av malacha. And Rabbi say kindling a fire is one of the prohibited malachas even on Yom Tiv. So Rabbi say this is actually quite incredible. So Rabbi Akiva says like this. This is incredible. Rabbi Akiva says you have to burn chametz. You have to burn chametz. Now Rabbi say on Yom Tiv you're allowed to use a fire, but you're only allowed to use a fire for ochel nefesh purposes. Rabbi Akiva says, well, if I need a fire to burn chametz, and I can't kindle a fire on Yom Tiv to burn chametz, that means the only time to burn chametz is when? Erev Yom Tiv. What an incredible limud. What an incredible limud. He says, you guys are all making this way too complicated. The Torah says you have to burn chametz. You can't burn chametz on Yom Tiv. You can't create a fire to burn chametz on Yom Tiv. You could create a fire to cook. You can use a fire, but you can't create a fire. So therefore, again, if I have to burn chametz, and I can't do it on Yom Tiv, it must be that halacha is to do it on Erev Yom Tiv. Rabbi Yossi Omer Eno Tzarech. Rabbi Yossi says also you don't need it. Sorry, Omer Ach Bayom Arishon Tashbisu Sa'ar Mibatechem. So the Gemara says Me'erev Yom Tiv. That means Erev Yom Tiv. Oh, Eina Ela B'Yom Tiv, or maybe it means on Yom Tiv itself. Talmud Lomar Ach Chilek. Therefore, we'll say ultimately again the word Ach comes to go ahead and divide the day. But one second, on Yom Tiv itself, how could this be permitted? Ha iskish hashbasas or lachilas chametz. This is what we said on the top of the Amid. It can't be on the day of Pesach itself, because remember again, the destruction of chametz is linked to achilas chametz, and achilas chametz is linked to achilas matzah, which working backwards means The moment that you have to eat matzah is the moment you can't eat chametz, and the moment you can't eat chametz is the moment your chametz must already be destroyed. So since, again, the obligation to go and eat matzah begins on Pesach night, therefore, Allah Almighty, the Isser Chametz is there as well. Once the Isser Chametz is there as well, that means chametz must already be destroyed by the first night of Pesach. Amar Rava says, Amar Beis, Rabbi say, this is incredible. Shma mina mid Rabbi Akiva class. We'll say from Rabbi Akiva's statement, we learn three things. Number one, Shma mina. Ein bir chametz el sif. Rabbi said this is going to be an incredible sugya daf yud beis. Rabbi Akiva says, Rabbi say something amazing. The only way to dispose of your chametz for Pesach is through beer, is through burning. Because remember again, Rabbi Akiva said it is clear that the obligation to destroy chametz, the prohibition of chametz begins on Erev Pesach. Why? To Rabbi Akiva, because it can't begin on Yom Tov itself. Why can't it begin on Yom Tov? Why not? According to Rabbi Akiva, because you can't create a fire to destroy chametz on Pesach. What's that? I could flush it down the toilet, right? I could throw it into the ocean. You see from Rabbi that according to Rabbi Akiva, there is only one way in which you are biblically permitted to destroy chametz, and that is beer. That is fire. So Rabbi say this is going to be the subject of incredible, overwhelming, seismic dispute. We're going to see it's a major achlokas that obviously has major nafkaminas. So the Gemara says that's number one. Rabbi Akiva we learn ein bir chametz al streifa. Number two, ushmamina havar lechalek yatzasa. Rabbi say furthermore we learn something else. Rabbi say this is a discussion with in Masech Shabbos. The Torah Rabbi says you're not allowed to do malacha on Shabbos. That's a blanket statement. The Torah then says lo sivaru eish b'chamosh osechem yom Shabbos. Right? The Torah then singles out kindling a fire. So there's a whole machlokes why the Torah singles out fire. Is it lechalik yatzasa or lelav yatzasa? Is it to tell me that whereas everything else in the Torah ultimately again is punishable by, let's say, an Isser Skila on Shabbos, maybe Havara is only a lav, or no, is it coming to teach me? The Torah singles out Havara to teach me about, say, the following idea. Had the Torah just said, Kol malacha lo sasa on Shabbos, you could have interpreted that to mean the following. Even if you do multiple malachas on Shabbos, you're only going to be chayiv once. So what does the Torah do? The Torah singles out Havara to teach you that every single time you do multiple malachas, you're going to be what? Chayiv for each and every one. Just like Havara is singled out as a standalone malacha, so too every malacha has its own identity. And even if in one lapse you performed 4 different malachas, you'll be chayiv 4 different times. That's what it means. Havara lechalek yatzasa ushmamina. But it's incredible. Lo amrina and hol v'hutra havara l'tzorech hutra shalosh. What else do you see from Rabbi Akiva? But it's just incredible. This is the concept ultimately again of mitoch. But this is the concept by Hilchos Yom Tiv that once certain activities are permitted for ochel nefesh purposes, they become permitted even for some non-ochel nefesh purposes as well. You see that according to Rabbi Akiva, we don't say that once kindling was permitted for ochel nefesh, for food preparation, it becomes permitted for non-food preparation. I will say, what's the ra'ayah? Because Rabbi Akiva does not allow you to kindle a fire for the sake of what? For the sake of what? Destroying your chametz. Therefore, I will say, the Gemara just points out, Rava just says 3 things we learn from Shitas Rabbi Akiva. Number 1, only way to destroy chametz is through fire. Number 2, Havara was singled out in order to go ahead and assign separate liability for each malacha. And number 3, we don't say that once kindling is permitted for food preparation purposes on Yom Tiv, it becomes permitted even for non-food preparation purposes. Good. Well, so here we go. Tanabanan. Shiva. So we'll say, so therefore, that is the end of that sugya. That is the end of that sugya. So we'll say, so halacha l'maisa, what comes out of here is everyone agrees that the biblical prohibition of chametz begins midday Erev Pesach. We essentially have 2 different schools of thought that really become one through the Brisa. First school of thought, Ach bayom harishon tashpisus su'ar mibatechem. There are 2 parts to that limud. Part 1, Yom Rishon refers to Erev Yom Tiv. And Ach comes to split Erev Yom Tiv into 2. Right? Ach says part of the day is permitted, part of the day is prohibited. We'll say that's approach number 1, with all of the different limud that went into that. Approach number 2 is Lo sochal, what was the pasuk? Lo sishchat al chametz dam zivchi. Right, literally again, do not check the Karban Pesach when chametz is around. That teaches us that as soon as you can go ahead and check the Karban Pesach, ultimately again there is an Isser chametz. The Brisa combines both of those limudim, to teach Rabbi said that the halacha is that the prohibition of chametz goes ahead and begins at midday Erev Pesach. Now, in terms of the Machlokes Ramein and Rabbi Yehuda, we'll have to see. So everybody agrees the biblical prohibition begins at midday. The shaila is what happens before midday. Does the prohibition of Achila begin earlier? So that Amirat Hashem we'll see. Good. Weiter. Says the Gemara, now is also great Gemara. Tan Rabbanon, quickly. Tan Rabbanon. Shivas Yom Shalom Aseh B'Ateicha. So let's listen to this. For 7 days, chametz should not be found in your home. So says the Gemara, Ma Talmud Lomar, what does this come to teach me? V'alo kvar ne'emar lo yira'eh lecha sa'ar. So we'll listen to this. B'chol gvulecha. So we'll say, here we go. So when it comes to chametz, Rabbi, there are two different prohibitions mentioned. There's the prohibition of bal yira'eh, bal yimatzeh, which literally means you can't see chametz and you can't find chametz within your domain. So what the Gemara is asking is, why do I need both? Right? The pasuk already tells me, Shivas yamim se'or lo yimatzeh bevaseichem. Right? For 7 days you shall not, right? Se'or chametz shall not be found in your home. But the pasuk already says, Lo yira'eh lecha se'or. The pasuk already says, Lo yira'eh lecha se'or b'chol gvulecha. Se'or should not be seen in all of your boundaries. So we'll say, take note of the difference in the wording. Pasuk number 1 says, for 7 days, Sa'ar Chametz should not be found in your home. Pasuk number 2 says, for 7 days, Sa'ar should not be seen in your boundaries. So says the Gemara, says, here we go, Lo yira lecha sa'ar, because the first pasuk says, or second pasuk, excuse me, sa'ar should not be seen to you. Shalcha yatara. So we'll say that teaches me as follows: that Allah Chalamaysa, Rabbi say the Isur chametz on Pesach is for me to see my own chametz. Shalcha yatara, aval atara shalachirim shal gavoa. But Rabbi say this is actually very interesting. The halacha on Pesach, Rabbi say, is that the only prohibition of chametz is chametz you own. In other words, halacha l'maisa, I can't see, so to speak, my chametz that I own. But if chametz belongs to someone else, or for that matter, chametz belongs to the Beis Hamikdash, I don't violate anything by quote unquote seeing that chametz or even having that chametz in my property. So the Gemara says, Yochol yatmin v'ikabel pikdonos min anachri. So you might have thought that maybe you could store chametz, right, or receive a pikadon. Right, pikadon means a guarantee from a nachri. In other words, we'll say, so you might have thought that Allah Chalamaysa, maybe I can go ahead and store someone else's chametz. Now, we'll say, now remember, yatmin means store, pikdonos means a guarantee, which means these are items over which I have achrayas, I have responsibility. Talmud lomar lo yimatzeh. Therefore, the pasuk says lo yimatzeh. We'll say, so lo yimatzeh means that even if I don't out and out own the chametz, but what? I have responsibility for the chametz. That's problematic as well. So we'll say, so for example, if I lent Joe the Nachri $1,000 and he gave me, his 120-year-old bottle of scotch, and that's the guarantee for the loan. Scotch is not the best day because it's chametz nuksha. But again, halacha l'maisa, even though again I don't own that, but because I have responsibility for that, that's problematic on Pesach. So the Gemara, so we'll say, by the way, this gets into a whole discussion about owning stock in certain companies as well. So again, we're going to see all of these sugyas. So the Gemara says, so I don't know if this applies to a nachri, to a non-Jew. But say shaloki bashto literally means that I'm not captured. Now what that means is a nachri who is not under my dominion, or who does not live with me. The Gemara says, nachri sheki bashto v'sharim chabechatzir. I will say, how do I know that this also applies to a nachri who is under my dominion or who lives with me? Now, the Gemara is going to ask, it should be just the opposite. In other words, it's much more obvious that I could violate the prohibition for a nachri who lives with me or who is subservient to me. Again, the Gemara is going to discuss this. Talmud lomar lo yimatzeh bevaseichem. Therefore, the pasuk says lo yimatzeh should not be found in your home. Ein li ella shebevaseichem. So we'll say, I only know that there's a problem with chametz in my home. Beboros besichlim ma'aros minayin. We'll say, how do I know that even if the chametz is not in my home, but the chametz is elsewhere on my property? For example, the chametz is in a pit, in a cistern, in a well. How do I know that that's problematic? Talmud lomar bechol gvulecha. Therefore, the Torah says you can't have chametz in any of your boundaries. Va'adayin ani omer bebatim omer mishum ba'yira ba'yimatzeh u'ba'al yatmin u'ba'yikal b'kdonos min ha'achri. But still, I could say, if the chametz is in my home, like I said, that I'm over on a Bal Yerah and Bal Yimatzeh and going ahead and taking and storing things or accepting guarantorships, big vulin, but maybe again I could say if the chametz is not in my home itself, but rather it's in my boundaries. Shalcha yatarah, aval atarah shel gavo v'shel acher. I'm sorry, shel acher v'shel gavo minayim. We'll say, so here's what I know. I know that in my home, I'm only in violation if I have some level of ownership or responsibility for the chametz. What happens if the chametz is not in my home, but the chametz ultimately, again, is somewhere in my boundaries? Somewhere in my boundaries, how do I know that halacha l'maisa, again, I'm only responsible if I own it? But if I don't own the chametz belongs to someone else, or the chametz belongs to the Beis Hamikdash, I'm not responsible. So the Gemara says, "Minayin litein es ha'amar shel zeh bazeh v'shel zeh bazeh Talmud lomar sa'or l'gzeira shava." So everyone both say, sa'or comes to teach me the connection between Bal Yerah and Bal Yimatzeh. So also remember again, halacha l'maisa, what's coming out is here is as follows. Remember, there are two different psukim. The first pasuk says, "Lo yimatzei sa'or lo yimatzei v'vatechem." Right? You can't have sa'or in your home. The second pasuk says, "V'lo yirah lecha." So Bal Yimatzeh is mentioned in conjunction with the home. Bal Yerah is mentioned in conjunction with your boundaries. Sa'or is the word that links both of those psukim to essentially create one harmonious principle. Rabbi say, what's the harmonious principle? That halacha l'maisa, the only time you're chayiv for chametz on Pesach is when? When you own it. But if you don't own it, let's say differently. When you own it, or what? You have responsibility for it. But as long as you don't own it, or you don't have responsibility for it, whether that chametz is in your home, or whether that chametz ultimately, again, is in your boundaries, it is not going to be problematic. So the Gemara goes right there. It says Sa'or by a home, Sa'or le'imatzi v'vasechem, v'ne'emar Sa'or bigvulin, and it says Sa'or by boundaries. Lo yirah lecha Sa'or, mas Sa'or ha'omer bebatim over mishum ba'yirah ba'yimatza ba'yatim ba'yikam piktonos min anachri. Just like Sa'or in your home, you're only chayiv if you own it or if you have responsibility for it. Af Sa'or ha'omer bigvulin over mishum ba'yirah ba'yimatza ba'yat I'm sorry. Let me read that again. Afsar ha'omer bigvulin. So to chametz that's mentioned in your boundaries, you are only over on Bal Yerah when, or Ba'yat Ba'yikam B'gdonos Anachri. Ultimately, again, you're only chayiv if you have some level of ownership or responsibility. One more line. Umas Sa'or ha'omer bigvulin shalcha yataroa aval atoroa shel achirim v'shel gavoa af Sa'or ha'omer bebatim shalcha yataroa aval atoroa shel achirim v'shel gavoa. So therefore, I both say halacha l'maisa. What comes out is as follows. Halacha l'maisa. The Gemara, we're going to discuss why the Torah needs two psukim, because that's still not totally clear. But what I know right now is I have two psukim. Pasuk number one is Lo Yira'eh Lecha Sa'ar. So pasuk number one is, Lo Yira'eh Lecha Chametz, for Lo Yira'eh Lecha Sa'ar B'chol Gvulecha. So pasuk number one is chametz should not be seen in your boundaries, and pasuk number two is Shiva Asem Yisrael Yimatzeh Bivatechem. So what we'll say, what we call Bal Yerah, Bal Yimatzeh. Bal Yimatzeh is mentioned by homes. Bal Yerah is mentioned ultimately again by gvul and by boundaries. Sa'or is the word that links the two psukim to create one harmonious principle. What's the one harmonious principle? Halacha l'maisa, you are not allowed to own chametz on Pesach. You are not allowed to have responsibility for chametz on Pesach. That is true whether that chametz is situated in your home. That is true whether that chametz is situated in your gvulin. Responsibility could mean you own it. Responsibility could mean you have it as a guarantorship. But halacha l'maisa, if you have no ownership, no responsibility, then there is no liability for seeing someone else's chametz, even if that chametz is situated in your home or in your boundaries. Whether that's the chametz of a Gentile, whether that's the chametz of the Beis Hamikdash. So I will say, even if the chametz sits on your property, in your gvul, or sits in your home, if it's not yours, you are not responsible for it. All right, I will say, we'll stop over here. I'll just tell you one quick, we'll stop over here. It's 9 o'clock already. We'll continue Meretz Hashem here tomorrow. Shkoyach.